Hi, everyone, and welcome to Karma Insights. Today, Shawn and I are going to be talking about strategic thinking in a complex world. And a big theme of what we are speaking about today is that there is a lot going on in the world, whether geopolitical, institutional change, or technology change. And at a certain level, a lot of folks are looking at this, and some will describe it as chaotic, some will describe it as complex, others might say it's complicated. And what we really want to do is focus in on what is going on and trying to reframe how we can think about all of these changes that are occurring in front of us. Shawn, why don't we start off with that? Can you tell me when you're talking with executives, leadership teams, or even clients, how are they feeling about the changes that they're facing today?
For sure, the pace of change is going up, right? So the speed people are having a hard time keeping up with, it's very unpredictable. Um, Gen AI is part of that, right? Gen AI is like new capabilities coming out weekly. Then you have the whole geopolitical side of things where even governmental rules, laws, regulations, whatever they may be, changing at a rapid pace, borders or geopolitical things that affect trade you can't do the next day because two leaders are maybe in disagreement. So I think people are really having a hard time dealing with all of this speed of change and uncertainty. And people, as you said, might be calling it chaotic, but I don't think it's really chaotic. I think it's complex. And I want to dive into the word complex versus complicated today because it sounds like similar words, but there's a lot of difference in the meaning I learned.
Absolutely, Shawn. So why don't we jump into that? And why don't we talk about a reframing? And I'm going to share my screen right now so we can both look at the Stacey Matrix. It would be great just to give everyone an overview of what it is and help define out these words of simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And in our pre-discussion of this, it really resonated for me in all of my consulting conversations with clients and looking at conversations as complicated versus complex, even this idea of oversimplifying things. And then sometimes thinking they're chaotic, which actually creates chaos in some ways because now everyone thinks they can't solve it. And so I tend to look at these frameworks and say to myself, if we have a language to talk about the ways to look at things, we can better address them. We can better figure out what our playbook is to deal with that situation. And the worst thing that can happen to us also is we think we're dealing with one type of problem, but we're actually dealing with another type of problem. And that makes solving the problem 10 times more complicated and 10 times more costly. If you can share your thoughts and frame this up for us, that would be
Yeah,
great.
yeah, absolutely. I saw this matrix some years ago and I thought it was super helpful about how to like sort out what's happening around you. And so I grabbed it and shared it with you. I love models, and I think this is just a model for how to think about the world around you when you're facing a challenge. Now let's go to the corners first. The lower left corner, simple. Everybody wants everything to be simple, of course. That's where we would like it to be is easy to understand and logical, rational, always best practice is happening. Let's take and contrast that with the upper right corner, which is chaotic. Chaotic is anarchy, right? People just want to try to make things more stable, get it out of the constant disruption. I think a lot of things today people might think are running chaotically because it's hard to understand. It seems like anarchy. Then we got the middle. Let's go to complicated. So back down to the left corner. Complicated is something that is a lot of moving pieces that all fit together in a predictable way. And one of the persons who taught me this was, they said, think of it like an engine, a car engine. An engine is like complicated, but once you know how it works, all the pieces that are machined very precisely, they can be taken apart and put back together, and you can know how to do it repeatedly, and you can measure its performance and predict it. So it's complicated, lots of pieces, but it's still your expertise. You can get your arms around it. Contrast that with complexity. Complexity are things that you can't predict, you can't really control, like the weather. The weather is complex. You really can't tell the weather what to do. You can yell at it if you don't like it, but it's not going to listen to you. And I think in circumstances that we deal with in business and in our personal lives, there's a lot of problems like that too around complexity. And those would be things like people are involved in making the decisions, which can be unpredictable, or new technology, which is evolving fast. And there's different techniques for handling complex problems versus complicated. So I'll pause there and we can go further.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think that what would be really helpful for me, or if you could share more about this, is maybe give an example of where folks will talk about something as complicated versus complex a bit more, and the edge of moving from complexity to chaos, so everyone can understand where those zones are.
Sure. Yeah. I think when it comes to complicated, complicated as an example would be you need to put up, let's say, a new website.
Mm.
And there's a lot of moving pieces to do that, but there's technology, there's processes, there's content, and everything that you have to do when you get it mastered all comes together. And you can get it running, you can get it operating because it's not the first website that anybody's built in the world. It's all knowable with the right expertise, and you can repeat it. Now, complex might be like you're trying to change the way of working or change culture in a company. And that's really complex because you're dealing with people. Your people are going to have opinions. There is no, when you're building company culture, there's no way of it in a process oriented way and repeating it. It takes dialogue and debate. It takes some test and learn. And the things that you want to do maybe are still emerging and not settled yet. So changing culture, changing kind of the direction of a company is an example of complexity. And some people, I think, in that circumstance might say, oh, it's chaotic. People don't know what we're doing. People don't know what's going on. But I think people can mistake complexity for chaos because it's so new. But if you dive into it, you can see that there are things that are influencing and directing, but it's just complex. So I hate to use the same words as the
To
definitions, but
define it.
those are some examples. Hopefully, it make it more tangible for people.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that as I look at this from a technology perspective, a lot these days is you look at AI, Gen AI, and all these things, and it feels complex right now. And as you and I were speaking just earlier, every day something new is coming out, and it feels like the weather. One day it's the end of the world because an AI system is going to take over the world, right? The next day someone's going to say everyone's going to lose their jobs, right? And then when we're working on implementing large language models within an organization, we say to ourselves, yeah, this is complex because I can't guarantee the output. I cannot fundamentally do that because it's a probabilistic model, right? And that's a very different way of thinking than the normal output of a manufacturing plant that a widget will be created, right? Or a standard software solution with a business rule, and this is the output. And but I think that's so important, right? And that's why I love this so much is that we're thinking the problem we're solving is complicated, but it's actually complex. And then everyone thinks we should be able to solve it in a normal project plan orientation where you've planned something, you do some analysis, you execute, you do some QA, and you get it out the door. But that's just not how it's
No, that's
working,
right.
right?
Think about like it like you're a pioneer.
Mhm.
When you're an innovator, it's really another word for saying you're a pioneer. You're blazing a new trail. To blaze a new trail is complex because you're going to have to adapt along the way that new trail. And
Yeah.
once the trail is laid down, still could be hard to take the trail. That could be complicated, but once it's blazed through the wilderness, there's a way to go. There's a method that's been proven. But if you're a pioneer, you're always innovating, you're always testing and learning. It's emerging, the thing that you're doing. And I think that's also how agile comes in, right? Agile comes
Hmm.
into the complex side of things because you're doing something for the first time. You're trying to test and learn and get feedback fast to adjust and adapt. So maybe you could also even say agile fits best to complexity, where maybe waterfall is more the complicated thing. It's I know the order, I know how it has to go. It's pretty certain, it's big, it's a lot of complicated stuff, but if I map it out, I can get there. It's not the unknown.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it's, what's funny about what you just said there, Sean, is that in so many of my conversations, we talk a lot about hybrid agile, where it's this cross between waterfall and agile. And in some ways, we want to have our cake and eat it too, right?
Yeah. We're trying to live on that line right there, that green line right there. We're trying on that line. We can't decide which
Yes,
one it is. And frankly, if you have a project, you probably can break it into two pieces, right? You can probably
sure.
say, hey, there's stuff we know what to do and how to do it. That's the complicated part. Put it in a waterfall. And then there's stuff here that we need to know MVP. How is it going
Yes.
to work? We're not so sure. It's what will the customer's reaction be? What's the value out of this thing? Time to put more of that approach of complex agile on it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Sean, why don't we jump into this a bit more of this idea that complex problems can't be solved in the traditional sense, right? And they have to be navigated, as you're saying, and I think the word pioneer is a great one. You're navigating unknown territory. How do you suggest that folks look at these problems or complex situations on how they're going to go after them to move them forward?
Yeah. We started by saying that the world is in a lot of turmoil and change and everything like that. So I think first, as a leader, my opinion is that there's more problems that are complex than in the past. I think a lot of the problems we had in the past had more complicated kind of domain. What now, if you were to say as a share, I think we get more problems that are complex than complicated. So I think the what we have to do as leaders is we have to be aware that's happening. And then we have to use a model like this to say, okay, here's a problem or a project, whatever you want to call it. What domain are we in? And make sure that we can match the domain we're in with the right techniques because there's different techniques for each of these domains. For example, in complicated, it's more like waterfall would be a technique, or make it very process oriented, step by step. But in a complex world, you can't do that. You have to steer things by influence, by testing and learning, by having principles that guide you, and then checking to make sure that things are always moving forward in the right direction. So I think as a leader, you got to make sure that you're not using the techniques of complicated problems in the complex domain. And I think leaders can get used to using the complicated techniques always, or simple techniques always. And then that's the trap that they could fall in is, hey, this is a complex problem. Then you apply the wrong techniques and you basically get stuck. You get in the wrong, you don't get the outcome you want.
Sure, sure. Absolutely, absolutely.
I think also, like in the complex domain, you have to ensure psychological safety for the team. So there's going to be a lot of testing and learning and maybe failure as well along the way to find the path. Again, you're a pioneer. So you got to make sure that with the team that they feel that safety to fail, learn from the failure, adapt, don't repeat the failure, and continue on.
Yes.
So those are some of the things that I think that you need. And I guess one more too I didn't add was you have to have this constant feedback loop. In complex, you got to like test, learn, but listen. Is it working or not? Adjust. So those are some of the things that I think leaders have to do, which is totally different than in a complicated, predictable type of setting.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I, I'll say that, this, Sean, that comes up for me in this is that I think that, and this has been a theme throughout some of our conversations for sure, but it's this idea of the principles that you need to lead by principles rather than, I suppose, standard operating procedures at some level. And the foundations for which where a lot of us are doing work are these standard operating procedure playbooks. And it's just not cutting it, frankly. It just isn't anymore. And I'd be curious, this idea that complexity almost has to be really embraced. It's something that we need to get more comfortable with. And one as leaders, but also as team members in working together. Can you tell me a little bit more about how to look at these problems as a leader?
I think about them like a sports analogy.
Mm,
So I think about it like these problems, I have to know the rule book of what game I'm playing to succeed. And of course, nobody writes the rule book for you. You have to have kind of the mental model of what are the rules for each of these games. So let's say the complicated one, that's the standard operating procedure rule book. In the complex one, that's more the principle rule book, right? And so you got, like in sports, if you're playing with the wrong rules or even the wrong like pads or whatever equipment you need to
yeah.
play the sport,
Hmm.
you're not going to succeed if you go into the game with the wrong rules or the wrong equipment. So as leaders, we have to equip ourselves with, okay, this is the game, this is the rules of that game, and this is the equipment I need for winning that game. And when you switch games, you got to switch rules, you got to switch equipment. And equipment is the tools you need to succeed, the approaches, the principles is an example of kind of an equipment thing. Like you better have principles for how to steer things because this game is a different game. So I don't know if that gave
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
clarity
love
that
it.
you're looking for, but
I love it.
people get stuck on the game they love to play. And I
Yeah.
think this is all of us. You get this leadership style that you have. You got this game you love playing that you're always winning at. And then guess what? the world throws another game at you. But if you
Yeah.
don't detect that other game, you're not going to be successful if you don't know the rules and you don't bring the right equipment. But we're all strong in some game we play. But you gotta shift. You gotta be able to adjust. And I wrote a little blog about leadership style. It's like golf. So this is a little bit similar, but a little different. Is when you go golfing, you have 14 clubs. Why do they clubs? You're gonna have different circumstances out on the course. You're not gonna use the putter on the driving range or the tee box. You're not gonna use the driver on the putt on the green. So you got to read the situation and switch. It's the same thing here. Same thing,
Hmm.
except this is about like how do you know the rules? How do you change the game, the equipment to be ready? So I hope that helps people to think
Yeah.
through this analogy, this metaphor.
Yeah, I love that, Sean. I think that's an excellent analogy. And I I will say this, and this, so one is we'll link to that blog post. I think you and I also had a separate discussion on leading in complexity, where we leading in uncertain times, where we talked about this idea of feeling lonely as a leader and how important that is. So we'll link to that as well. And we'll link to the Stacey Matrix as well. I think to wrap up the conversation here, what I'm really taking away from this is one, it's really important to distinguish what type of problem you are facing, whether it's simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic, frankly, right? And to know what those lines are, but to also build in some level of self-reflection to know where I'll say that, and I'm going to say it this way, and you tell me if this makes sense, Sean, okay? It's where my intellectual mind goes, but perhaps where my emotions go as well. And I think that's really important because I think we might want to say something's chaotic, but it's actually complex. And we sometimes think something's complicated, but it's actually complex because we don't want to feel the fear of being in a complex problem. And then I think even simple problems, we might oversimplify something because, frankly, we don't want to acknowledge that we don't know how to solve a problem. And I think it's really funny, right? It's if you don't have that language to actually talk about a problem, you're going to be in for a host of issues when you really start taking things apart. Sean, thank you so much for your time,
Yeah.
and I
Can
love
I
this
add
conversation. Please,
one
anything
final
else to
thought
add?
here? One final thought. You're right. We're all humans, and our emotions steer us in ways that we don't fully control sometimes.
Yeah,
And there's another metaphor that I've heard that I think is fitting here, and that is leaders have to go up to the balcony. So if you're on the field playing a game, you see all the interaction, everything like that, but it may look complicated, it may look complex, or it may even look chaos. But if you take another perspective and go up to a higher viewing point and look down at the what's going on, you can see things that you wouldn't see by standing on the ground floor, like what's going on. And so you gotta exercise that. You gotta, as a leader, pause and go up to the balcony and see the landscape. And that's where these kind of models help you, like a Stacey matrix. It's like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? It is not chaos. Wait a minute, I see this and this. It's not complicated, it is complex. Okay, now I know what to do. So you got to get yourself out of it, get yourself out of the emotions, and go to the balcony to really look at what's going on. And you got to get used to that as a leader, that's your job. Your job is
yeah.
to keep the clarity and make the plan for people, but you can't do it from the same vantage point. You really got to get to another perspective to see things like this. So don't, if you're like in a big confusion, that means you probably need another perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely, Sean. All right, Sean, it's been lovely speaking and looking forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, thanks for the time.